So we get started today. We'll finish briefly the lecture on entity authentication, and we move to the lecture on key establishment or authenticated key establishment. So last lecture we looked at the problem of entity authentication. How can Bob establish that he's talking to Alice and that Alice is there and active? And we looked at passwords and also at static certificates with your name, and we showed it can help you indeed to determine that somebody is there, but it doesn't give you liveliness because it can be replayed. If you want to establish liveliness, you need something called challenge response, where a challenge is being sent, and then you get a response, and that can be either symmetric key, a MAC, or public key, a signature, or even a zero-knowledge proof. And so that's what we compared, all these options. And then we looked at the problem of the fact that we can't do computations in our head, so we use devices for it, like smart cards, or maybe our smartphone. And the problem is, what do you do with a stolen device? Or how do you then prove to the device that it's in the hand of the right owners, like PIN codes? Or you can also use biometrics. And biometrics is not shareable. That's an intrinsic advantage of biometrics. It's in principle easier to use, but of course it has privacy implications. And as I explained, also some security implications. Now there is still another problem that actually entity authentication is the wrong primitive for many applications. So we use it a lot, but if you think about it, it's not really what you need. And I'll bring you back to my student time. So I was studying engineering, and I was doing a project in computer science. In computer science, on the first floor, there was the PDP-11s. There were two PDP-11s. They were like the first mini computers, so the computers going from the IBM mainframes in special bunkers to a computer in your department. And then on the ground level, you had terminals. And these terminals were dumb, so they were not like PCs. They had a keyboard and a display, and that was it. And so every PDP had 16 slots. So there were 32 slots in total. And if you wanted to work, you first went to the terminal room and you put your code on and your bag next to a terminal to reserve the terminal. And then you wrote down the number of the terminal. Then you went upstairs and you took the cable of your terminal and plugged it in a free slot of the computer. I know it sounds like, it's ages ago, but this was the early 80s. And then you logged in, and you were logged in and you could start working. Now imagine what would happen if, and of course the professors also had slots, but they had fixed slots. And so they were plugged in permanently, so they could work all the time. But imagine that you came there, you had a project to finish, or you wanted to read your email because there were no smartphones and no laptops, so you wanted to read your email or finish a project, but all the slots were taken. But you just had to 5 minutes check something. So I never did this, but what you could do in principle was take the slot of the professor, unplug the professor because he was for lunch anyway, and then you plugged in, and then you went down to your terminal and you could work. I never did this, but some students did this stuff. So, but if you think about it, at the moment you did this, you actually took over the connection of the professor. So you didn't have to log in anymore because you were in his session, right? His terminal was replaced by your terminal. And so that shows that logging in is not enough because you can just take over the session and whatever password the professor had, it didn't matter. You were in. And the same thing happens in communications. You have this complex login procedure where you can do whatever you want, zero knowledge, public key, biometrics. But if then afterwards somebody cuts the line and takes over the communication, then they can be you, right? So it's the same thing, a bit stupid analogy. If somebody goes to an ATM machine to withdraw money and they enter their card and their PIN code, then you push them away, you take the money, right? So how do we solve this? Well, clearly at distance authentication is not enough. What you need is authenticated key establishment. So what you do is you have to have a protocol in which you agree on a secret key. At the same time, you establish that you're talking to Alice and Bob, so you establish the identities, and you agree on a fresh key. And from now on, you will use authenticated encryption with those keys. So if somebody takes over the session, they don't know the key because they were not involved in the initial negotiation. And then they can't actually read the messages that are sent to them because they don't have the encryption key, and they can't inject messages because they can't do authentication of the messages. That's really what you need. And so this is how the modern world works. if you use TLS or SSH or IPsec, there is an authenticated key establishment protocol, or also your mobile phone, any phone call you make there, and then from then on, all the communication is protected with that key. And then you log out, and then this key is thrown away, and next time you start over, you generate a new key. This is more or less how the world works today. But now you understand why this is necessary. So even if you don't have secrets, you still would do this. There is another problem which is actually much more subtle, and it cannot be solved with more cryptography, as you will see. It's also known as the grandmaster chess problem. So it's a simple puzzle. So assume that you have a chess competition, and so you put in this lecture hall, you put a grandmaster chess, and there is a symmetrical lecture hall the other side of the hallway, you put another grandmaster chess. And then you take a 6-year-old child and you teach her the rules of chess. They can learn this. It's not so difficult, right? There is a few tricks, but you can teach them a lot of chess. And so this child plays both grandmasters, and it will either win from one, or it will actually draw against both after 1 day of lessons. So that's the puzzle to solve. And the same problem, unfortunately, happened in the context of war between South Africa and Namibia. So South Africa had quite modern planes, and Namibia had these old crappy planes. And of course, in war, unfortunately, you also have anti-aircraft missiles. And the big problem is you don't want to shoot at your own planes. So for this, in fact, challenge response was invented. It was called Identification Friend or Foe, IFF protocols. It was invented during World War II. So you ask a question to the plane, and if you get the right answer, the right challenge, then you don't shoot it down. Okay. And of course, the Namibians had problems because their planes were much slower, they were easier to detect. So the South African planes were faster, they could anyway avoid the old crappy anti-aircraft missile. But so what if the Namibians want to do something in South African territory, so they fly their plane there, and they get a challenge. And they don't know the answer, so they will be shot, and they're too slow to evade. But the Namibians were very smart. If you don't have money and you don't have good equipment, you have to be smart. So they send a question to a nearby Namibian ground station who found a nearby South African plane and asked the question. And that plane doesn't want to be shut down, so it actually gives the answer, and then it was forwarded, and this is how they escaped. Okay, so, and the same thing happens in the Grandmaster chess problem, which you can read about on Wikipedia. So you just let the two play against each other. That's the answer of the puzzle. And so this sounds like funny, but in fact, it's a major problem. So to give you an example, in the Netherlands, all the students get a MyFair card with free public transportation. It's a great gift of society. So what happens if you take a train or a bus, you have to scan in and scan out. Now, what you could do is you could actually do the same protocol as a student. You could actually make an online server, a service. Say, go with your smartphone to any gate of a train station in the Netherlands. You get a challenge by the gate, forward it to my card at home, which is connected to my smartphone. This is the web service, via the mobile web service. I'll give you the right answer to the challenge, and now you can actually travel as if you were me. Okay? So the other model is that we see being deployed is called more the terrorist problem, or the mafia problem, sorry. So the terrorist problem is one guy goes and forwards a challenge. This is also the public transport, but you also have the mafia problem. So today you have quite secure protocols for credit card payments. So you can no longer break them. They're secure protocols using signatures and so on. But what you do is you set up a shop, a pop-up shop where you sell whatever, cheap stuff, or you just buy or you rent a newspaper shop where you sell cigarettes to people. And people come there with their credit card and they pay. But what you do is, in fact, at the same time, one of your friends goes to a diamond shop and buys expensive diamonds. And because those things can be transported easily and very good for money laundering. So at the moment they pay, they get a challenge to pay for the 5,000 euro for the diamonds. But in fact, rather than sending the right answer, they forward the challenge to the newspaper shop where somebody is buying a pack of cigarettes or a newspaper, and they get the challenge, and they believe they buy a newspaper. In fact, they buy for 5,000 euro diamonds. And so then the response is forwarded, and this is how you can do this. So this is called mafia fraud, because you need an insider to work with you. And so, you know, when you first get this problem, you think, oh, we just have to use more clever cryptography. But the problem is, there is no clever cryptography that can solve this problem. Because no matter how clever your protocol is, it's not going to be solved. By the way, another case where there is really videos online, which is being used, the same thing is to steal cars. So there is very cool videos online where you see people, security cameras of thieves who arrive at some house, and one guy goes with the antenna to the car, and the other one goes with the antenna to the front door, where people have in their pockets their car keys, and this is how they drive off with the car. Same attack. So this is actually really happening. Okay? And so there is no cryptography that can help you. The only difference between the black and the green is that the green communication is longer, so it takes longer. So what you can do is you can measure the time to respond, and if it takes too long, you can reject. Okay? But the problem is that it's very hard, because if your protocol uses a smartphone, you have an NFC chip, and it has to talk to the API, and the API has to talk to the operating system has to talk to the application. So that easily takes milliseconds. Okay? And so the problem is that electromagnetic waves, in 1 nanosecond, they travel 30 centimeters, speed of light. Okay? So in fact, if you need a millisecond to operate, that corresponds to 1,000 times 30 centimeters, so that's 300 meters. So in fact, if the two shops are 300 meters apart, then you have to detect this, you have to be faster than a millisecond. So it's very hard, actually, because all the software is so wasteful, and it spends tens of milliseconds doing nothing. So even a normal card takes 30 milliseconds to respond. In that time, if you may build faster hardware to the distance, you can easily bypass kilometers and fake it. So in fact, today, most financial system cards, and also those cards, they have detection, but very slow detection. So if you really, really exceed the time, so if you have an app with a smartphone, then you will be detected. But if you would use special hardware to defeat the protocols, you can still get by. And so the only way to then defeat that is build time detection in special hardware, so that you can really detect nanosecond responses. And I know there is some startup companies working on this, and there is some technology being deployed. We also did quite some research on this, but it's a very hard problem to do, because you have to more or less build security into the hardware where normally there is no security, in the Bluetooth protocol, or really in the hardware chips, and not put it somewhere in an app or in a smart card application. So we call this distance bounding. So you try to establish that the other party is nearby by doing several quick exchanges, and you kind of speculate that if you're at a distance, you can't be fast enough. So there is other elements of using location. So in the beginning, there was dial back. I think I talked about this. Also, people try to detect your IP address. For example, Netflix will serve you certain content only in certain national regions. So they try to detect your IP address. And then, of course, there is VPNs to bypass this. There is also techniques to geolocate somebody based on timing. So they talk to your device from 10 servers over the internet, and based on the answers, they try to detect your location. So it's hard to spoof, but of course it is possible to spoof it. But this kind of is an arms race. It's not very secure, but these kind of things are happening all the time to try to use your location. Somehow, of course, the mobile operator knows where you are. So you see this when crime cases are solved, and they say, well, this phone was seen within a radius of so many meters. So this is how they today solve many crimes, because people actually take their mobile phones with them while they go on a crime spree, which is not so smart. And then, of course, you have GPS, but GPS can be spoofed. And so you can just transmit GPS, or collect GPS signals here and send them somewhere else. And this is what's been happening in drone warfare. So you try to spoof the drones of the other party so that they actually will think they're in a safe zone and will land. This is how the US lost a drone to Iran, because the GPS was spoofed by the Iranians. And the drone thought it was in a US base, so he landed, and then the Iranians captured the drone. So the game there is try to get trusted GPS, and Galileo tries to add some authentication to this, but it's not easy at all. But these are problems for, definitely will be I think more research will be done and more deployment in the next decade to try to really find where everybody is. It's also very privacy invasive, of course. Who you are with and where you are is very privacy invasive. But in general, doing this in a trustworthy way is not so easy. And doing it in a privacy-friendly way is very hard. But this is what's becoming increasingly important as well. Okay, so let's stop with the indication part. So, but definitely the main message here, we're moving away from passwords finally, and we're moving finally away slowly from symmetric key, although most of the companies that roll out multi-factor authentication still use MACs and use 8 digits, or Microsoft Authenticator, you have to type 2 digits in your phone. So the more advanced schemes like the Key Authenticator is public here. This is where the trend is. More biometrics is the trend, and then use of location is the trend, and less privacy. And so more or less what the political debate is about is that Europe tries to create a mobile wallet. So the text will be approved in the parliament in 12 days, and it's still not public, which is really bizarre in terms of democracy, that you advocate transparency, you change the text in the final moment after some lobbying, and then 12 days before the vote, the text is not even public. But so everybody will get a mobile wallet, and it will replace your ID card or your It's Me, or will be part of your It's Me, but also have your health data. This is what the Commission has, your driver's license, your study results will all be in one app. And so, of course, our concern is privacy of this, that everything becomes linked to this. Okay, so now I motivated key establishment. So we look at the goals of key establishment, look at some flaws in protocol. It will be for next week, and we will learn gradually to analyze new protocols. So cryptography in general is the business of moving protection of data to protection of keys. So you have to generate keys, which is by itself a challenge. You need good random number generators. And the question is, can you do this in software? Do you need hardware support? So since about 10 years, all Intel processors have an instruction called read rand, and I guess AMD as well, where you get lots of random bits. The question, of course, is, do you trust Intel? That these bits are really random and that there is no secret things. There have been some audits of this, but the full design is not public. And I think today getting random bits is easier than in the past. But of course, there is specific circumstances. For example, if you have a virtual machine in the cloud, how do you give this random bits? And you can call the read rand instruction, but how are you sure that you really get the result of the read rand instruction and no intercept or somewhere in the hypervisor or the layer in between, some strange things happen, right? So the farther you're away from hardware, the harder it is to trust random bits you get. Then you have to register keys, certify. So we'll talk this lecture about how to establish key between multiple parties. Then once you have agreed the key, it may have to be installed in a device. Then you, of course, use it. Then you may have to archive it, so you want to later on access it. So a key you used last year, you may want to keep it to decrypt old stuff, or you may re-encrypt. For example, in the cloud, there is policies. It's imposed on the banks that they have to change all their keys within 6 months or a year. So you have like these terabytes of data being encrypted, and then you have to do key rollover, which means at some moment you have to re-encrypt everything with new keys. And if you don't want to do this, you have to keep copies of all your old keys. So there is lots of, you can imagine there's lots of discussion, because this is, as the Americans say, where the rubber meets the road. This is where the real problems happen. You as a security person or cryptographer have to talk to all the other people in the business. And everything you do will cost money and will be complex. And so you will have a continuous fight to get things properly done. So you may want to give your key to a third party, for example, in the company as well, because assume the engineers work now all on encrypted devices or encrypted storage in the cloud. And then one day somebody leaves the company. You don't want to find an encrypted hard disk and don't know what the key is, because then all the work that this person has done is lost. So you probably in a company want backup of the work that is being done. You want a backup of the key as well. And then also you have to destroy keys, and this is getting harder and harder. Because, for example, in modern hardware, in SSDs, in fact, it's not what it seems it is. So if you destroy data, it still remains there. I mean, in fact, internally, all the addresses are remapped all the time. So in fact, even if you delete something, it's still there. Already, even in classical hard disks, if you delete something, normal process is that the first bit of the sector is put to 0 or so, and all the data remains there, or the first character is overwritten. But all the data remains there. So, in fact, destroying stuff is harder and harder. I always have to laugh, but if you go to trade shows, you have these Japanese guys, they sell machines like half the size of this counter to actually burn all your key material. That's big ovens that at high temperature really destroy all the electronics and crush hard disks and then burn everything so that not a single bit remains. In fact, it's harder than you think to really destroy something. It's very hard to recover a key for cryptocurrencies. You'll never find it back. You lose your millions. But if you really want to destroy something, that's very hard. If you really want to make sure that everything is gone, that's not so easy. You may also have seen papers where people buy machines on eBay and then discover what they find on it. Lots of personal data, medical data, financial data. So, I mean, doing a factory reset on your device, you will not get back your data, but I buy your device, I can find everything back. That's the reality today of technology. But this is really where the problem is. But so we'll only focus on key establishment because all the rest is much more governance and organizational aspects, not so much technology. So we'll go to a very boring part of definitions, and then we'll look at multiple cases. For this part, there is a very good text available, chapter 12 of the Handbook of Applied Cryptography. It's still up to date, although this is quite old, but in fact it was written at a very good time when this research was being done, and we better understood these kind of protocols. And it's a very didactical explanation of all the protocols, how they work, and what their problems are, so how they fail as well. And this is included in the course on Toledo as well. So, the graphic protocol is an interaction between multiple parties. So, strictly speaking, if you encrypt data on a USB stick or your hard disk, it's not a protocol. You need multiple parties, Alice and Bob. And they follow a number of steps, and the goal is to achieve a common objective. So you could say encryption is a protocol, authenticated encryption, where Alice and Bob perform a sequence of steps to encrypt and authenticate data, and Bob then does some steps to somehow decrypt and verify the authenticity of the data. But so we'll look here at key establishment protocols, but there is other protocols to run auctions, to do elections. So we discussed that last time. There is quite some ways to achieve goals. There is, in fact, any goal you can achieve in the physical world we want to achieve with cryptography, and we can make a protocol for this. But now we look at a very narrow set of protocols for key establishment. And we'll stick here to the case of two parties. Of course, there is also the problem of multiple parties. Think of group chat. This is actually quite a tricky problem. So in WhatsApp and Symbol, there is group chats, and you want the key between multiple parties. This is much more tricky because parties can leave or can be kicked out and can join afterwards. So there is many issues, and it took quite a while to. These standards actually are very recent and very fresh. To do it properly is actually very tricky. We'll just stick here for two parties. It's already hard enough, as you will see. And you have several variants. There is key transport, where Alice makes a key and sends it to Bob. There is key agreement, like Diffie-Hellman, where Alice and Bob interact and then they agree on a secret key. There is something which is not so desirable, which is static key agreement, which means you always find the same key. It's called key pre-distribution. There is some use cases for this, but this is rare. In practice, we don't prefer this. In practice, we want dynamic key establishment, but you always get a new session key. And then the big difference is, do you need a central party or not? And most large-scale systems need a central party. They have some involvement, either a party that generates the keys and sends them out, or at least helps in transporting the keys, or there is a party that certifies public keys. So this is more or less what you have always. But of course, at a small scale, you could still do things between two parties without a trusted party involved. So in practice, we use a lot of session keys. Session key is very simple. That's a key used only for a session. What is a session? Well, if you open a browser and you interact with the website, you read your email, then you close the browser, that's a session. Or you make a phone call, that's a session. Or you browse for a while on the internet over your mobile phone, that's a session. There will be a timeout, and maybe after whatever, 15 minutes or half an hour, the operator will say, now I will start a new session, because I think this key has been used long enough. So in general, it's hard to establish long-term keys. So you don't want to use them to encrypt data. You want to use those to agree on session keys, and then use those to encrypt and authenticate data. So this is also to make life of cryptanalysts hard, like me, because if you change the key all the time, it's much harder to break things. As an example, the best shortcut attack on DES, right, the DES block cipher from 1977, if you know 2 to the 40 plain text ciphertext pairs, which is a lot, but okay, then you can actually find the key faster than searching to the key space in about 2 to the 40 time. But so if you make sure you change your key every 2 to the 20, so every 2 to 20 blocks, then you're actually okay. Then the attack doesn't work. Also, the CBC mode is collisions. We discussed this. If you encrypt too much data in CBC mode, then information starts leaking, or also in counter mode, or in any mode, actually. But if you change your key all the time, then this leakage is prevented. So there is good reasons to change your key all the time and not use the same key for everything, but have long-term keys, and based on this, make short-term keys that you change all the time. So also, if your key is compromised, the impact is not so bad. So for example, in mobile telephony, so from 2G onwards, you have a SIM card, and the SIM card sits in the chip. It will move to an eSIM, but in the end, the SIM card comes from your operator, and establishing this is kind of a bit of a pain. Today, you still have to go to the shop. They want to get rid of this because it's actually very expensive. It's expensive to run shops because you have to pay rent, you have to have people in there that you have to train, and they can misbehave, and you have to give them infrastructure, and you have to supervise them. So in fact, any infrastructure where everybody has to show up is expensive. Also the banks used to have a bank office or branch on every corner. They want to get rid of it because it's too expensive, right? But so establishing keys is hard. And if you look at the mobile ecosystem, so your mobile phone, it has a SIM card. This is from your operator. So Base or Mobile Vikings or Proximus, whoever is your operator, they give you this SIM card. What they don't want is that this key ends up in your phone because they don't trust your phone, right? You may have rooted your phone. You may be using a Linux-based phone or this free phone, and so they're not sure what's happening to this key, and then you may share this phone and so this key and so on. So they don't know. They don't want to give this key to the phone because they don't trust the phone. And now with eSIM, what's going to happen is, well, they finally have given up because of the financial pressures and so on. So but they're going to put it in a secure chip called secure element in the phone. It will be loaded there, and still the applications will not be able to get to this key. The other problem of the SIM card is the SIM card was, these chip cards we have today, they were designed in the 80s, and they have an interface of about 2,000 bits per second, which was a blazing fast speed in the 80s. But today is, of course, a joke. So you cannot take the data from your 5G phone, send it to the SIM card to be encrypted there, and then send back to the phone and then send out because it's way too slow, right? So this is why in a mobile phone, you generate a session key in the SIM card, and this is then sent to the phone. And if that one gets compromised, well, so what? It's only a temporary key. You cannot make expensive phone calls with this, or only limited time. The impact is much less. So we also look at a scenario where you have many people in the network, and then you also want to use session keys. That's on the next slide. And in general, you want to make sessions of communication independent. If you use different sessions in your browser, you want to have all those to be independent. For example, if you give your machine to somebody else, you don't want the same key to be used. So the typical setting is a symmetric key setting. So imagine that somehow we establish that we need secure communication between the electrical engineering department, the computer science department, mechanical engineering, where we're here, and maybe some other department, physics or so. You can actually do this if you're worried about this. Then every party, what you have to do is, at the electrical engineering department on top here, they have to share a key with each of the other departments. So you have to establish 3 keys with each of the parties. And so in total, if you add it up, there will be 6 keys that have to be established. You know, if you're the sysadmin, you generate the keys, you visit the departments, you install the keys. It's going to take you half a day, but then you're done. Okay, that kind of works. But of course, this university has 100 departments. And if you want to do it for 100 departments, then you need 4,950 keys. And installing this will take the better part half a year or so, right? You have to go to every one of those places. So it just doesn't scale. You can't do this. You can't install a key in every department. This is just this university, and then I didn't even speak of the remote sites. This university has 12 remote sites, so it's just a nightmare. So what you will do in a larger scale system, you will install what we call a key distribution center. This is, in our case, it would be ICTS, so the IT services. And they will establish a key with every department. So as a department, if you want to join their network, they will visit you. And they say, OK, you're part of our network. We'll install a key here. And then if the departments want to talk, they will actually run a protocol with ICTS, with the KDC. And they will make a session key for temporary communication between these two parties. And then after this communication is stopped, they just throw away the key. And next time, they ask for a new key. And so you see here, you only have to manage a linear number of keys. And then for every session, you need a key. But these are temporary keys. So you don't need to store thousands of keys and install thousands of keys. So this is really how things work in practice. But here, again, you don't want to keep a key for all the parties. It can be thousands of parties. You only want keys for those parties you're talking right now. And so this is all linear in the size, in the number of players and number of connections. Is not quadratic. This is a quadratic problem, and that doesn't scale to systems with thousands of users, or let alone K11 with 10,000 of machines and 70,000 users. So now we have a very boring slide, but it's a very important slide. It's all definitions, but we will need them. And the good news is that the first one we know already, entity indication, that Alice is convinced of the identity of Bob, and the fact that Bob is alive and active during the protocol. We know this already. The second one we also know already as well, data authentication. Then one is convinced that the source of data, the data has not been modified. So this is data origin authentication and data integrity, these two aspects. Again, this we learned already. You can get this from a MAC or a signature. So there is no time element here. If I sign something today, you can check it immediately, but also tomorrow and a month later and a year later. You can keep checking that this data came from this source and has not been changed. While here in entity authentication, you have a time element, a notion of a session, and an interaction. So now we come to the three new definitions, and they're really a bit annoying and confusing. I apologize for this, but we will, as you will see, we'll need those definitions. So the first one is implicit key authentication. There, Alice knows that only Bob can find the key. Okay, now the formal definition, one party, Alice, is assured that no other party, aside from a specifically identified second party, this is Bob, has the possibility to determine the secret key. So Alice knows that only Bob can find the key. Okay, it's kind of logical. Now, if you run a protocol, you also would like to know this party has the key. We call this key confirmation. So you run a protocol, and now in the end you check, do you have the key? Okay. So key confirmation means one party is assured that a second party has possession of a particular secret key, but this party, you may not know who this is. Okay, so implicit key authentication, you know that only Bob can have the key, you don't know if Bob has the key. Key confirmation, you know somebody has the key, but you don't know who it is. Now, you say, this is really crazy, you really need both. Exactly, and that's called explicit key authentication. Explicit key authentication, Alice knows that only Bob can find the key, and Bob has found the key. Okay, so that's good. So now the question is, why do we need those two things here? If it's clear, what we want is authentication and explicit key authentication. That's really what we want from every protocol. Now, as we will see, many protocols actually don't provide explicit key authentication. They only provide implicit key authentication. So this is why we need this term. Now, I know it's confusing, but we'll go to many examples, and hopefully after a while you get used to these terms. Why do many protocols fail to provide all these properties? There are several reasons. One is that first they may try to achieve it and fail, so it's hard to make a protocol. Second, protocols were designed, or the idea was conceived in the late 70s, and most protocols were designed in the 80s and early 90s. And I know it's hard for you guys to imagine, but at that moment, communication speeds of 14 kilobits per second were high-speed communications. Okay, 14 kilobits per second. So that meant that every byte you sent, everything you sent, every step extra was a problem. So there was a game of, can you do these protocols with sending as few bytes as possible? And of course, it's a very dangerous game. And so sometimes people messed up and didn't get the properties they want. Now today, of course, we have a different game or a different challenge. Today, the challenge is, in fact, that some servers may be at the other side of the globe, and the speed of light is a limit. In fact, today, what you want to avoid is not sending bytes. What you want to avoid is round trips, going up and down, because that actually slows you down. And so this means that over time, as the properties of communication networks change, you have to change your protocols as well, because you have different optimization requirements. But in the beginning, it was just, if you made it too complex, it was just not implementable. So there was a sport, do as little as possible and achieve as much as possible with as little as possible. Today, we can a bit laugh at this, but it still has influenced a lot of protocols we use today, actually. For example, even in 5G, the protocol you use is largely driven by constraints of the 80s, because the operators don't want to change it anymore. They have so many base stations out there, so many things in their systems, they don't want to change it. So everything else has changed, but the protocol to establish a user has only changed between 2G to 3G, but not after that. It's still the same. Legacy, legacy, legacy. Yes?
If you have the key, explicit key authentication, are you also sure that no other party has the key?
Yes, because explicit key authentication is implicit key authentication, which means that only one party can find the key, and then you know that one party has found the key, so that must be the right party. Yes, it's a very good question. So, previous lecture focused on entity authentication. So today we look at key establishment, but really what we need is to authenticate with key establishment. So this is where we put the boundary, is we want at least to have implicit key authentication, otherwise we say the protocol has failed. Right? If you establish a key but you have no idea who the other party is, that's not so useful. And there is some more things to be discussed. So some protocols use a time. And this is very easy, so you can, as we will see, we already saw a protocol for authentication where you map the time, and then you establish indeed you're there, and this requires only one pass, requires no challenge response. So it would, for modern times, it's very good to have clocks. There is other benefits, because if somebody delays your message, and there is a timestamp in your message, then you can actually detect this. Right? I don't know what it happened to you, but sometimes if strange things happen in sysadmins or so, you get emails from a year ago sent to you. And like, what is this? And it takes a while to figure out, oh, this was an email from last week or last month or last year. So in general, it's good that you know what time a message has arrived. And also, as we will see, you can also limit, you need clocks to limit validity periods of keys, that the key is not used forever. So it is actually good to have clocks involved. Or timestamps. There is just a big problem, is that I will not do the demo now, but I can go to my PC and I can change the clock. So in fact, the clock is not reliable, and there is no way to check that maybe the attacker changed the clock. And then now the question is, can you trust your clock? Because clocks drift a bit. If you don't do anything, then clocks after a while go out of sync. And then there is something called NTP, Network Time Protocol. So then you can configure this on your device, and then it will run a protocol to establish the time. It is an insecure protocol. So an attacker can actually send you the wrong time. So in terms of security, actually, NTP is less secure, because most cases you will actually be more accurate clocks, but if the attacker wants to go after you, you actually have the wrong clock. Okay, and so in fact, using clocks sounds very attractive, but getting a secure clock in a device is very hard. It sounds easy, but in fact it's very tricky. You would need a special tamper-resistant component and special protocols to make sure it keeps in sync. And so most people don't do this because it's hard. Of course, what you can do is the most reliable or more reliable way is GPS clocking. GPS also gives you time, but of course, again, it can be spoofed. So it's not watertight. So in general, my advice is try to avoid relying on high-resolution clocks, because it's just too hard in practice. What we do in practice, we use a value used only once, or a nonce, and then you have something as a challenge response. So one value sends you a random number, which hopefully is unique. That never happened before, and then you will MAC it, or you will SIME it, or you will do something with it. You include it in the next step of the protocol. And then there is two variants of this. So one thing which you have in smart cards, in your bank cards, and so on, they actually have a special counter in there. And that counter always increases. So every time you put your smart card, so the problem is the smart card has no clock, right? I mean, if you have it in your pocket, it doesn't have power, it doesn't have a clock, so it doesn't know what day it is, right? Your smart card is the worst device to keep time, but it actually has a counter, and every time you put it in a reader, it will increment the counter as the first thing. And so it's also protected by the operating system. You can't just increment or decrement the counter. Well, you can increment it by using the card more and more, but you can never decrement it. And so all financial transactions have a unique number, because every time you use your bank card, it produces a unique number. Okay? And then what happens if this number reaches the limit, so it used to be 65536, then your card stops and you have to get a new one. That's how it works. Unless there is a bug, and then it starts back in 0, and then you have a serious problem. Now, they may sound a very easy solution, but in fact, in the cloud, it's very hard to do. Because in the cloud, you have virtual machines in containers being pumped up, and then these things crash, and then they brought back up. But where were they? And what numbers have they used in the past? These new instances have no idea. Okay, they don't know where they are. So again, on a device, you don't know. I mean, you get a blue screen on your favorite operating system, then you reboot, but your computer does not know, you don't know where it was. Was the last transaction already processed, or in fact, did the processing stop in the middle transaction? So in fact, on a computer, on a general purpose computer, it's much harder to find out state and to have state. So in fact, what you there use is randomness. You hope you have enough random bits, and you generate a random number every time in the hope that it's unique. And so you have to take into account the birthday paradox. Depending on how many random numbers you need 64 bits or maybe 128 bits to be sure that repetition is very unlikely. But so it matters in which context you implement the protocol. So now you understand why smart cards have different protocols than maybe your laptop or your phone. And that every time you have different applications, like devices we implant in our bodies or sensors in nature, or whatever, you get new protocols that have been designed taking into account the new constraints. There is many more things now. So now there is actually, I have in my office very thick books full of cryptographic protocols. So there is actually 10,000s of protocols and many bad ones. So because of course you can choose which kind of authentication you need. Entity authentication, key confirmation, implicit explicit key authentication. You can choose whether to authenticate both parties or only one. So I think I mentioned this last time that in 2G, the network is not authenticated. So it's very easy to set up a box that will tell you this is Proximus, and your phone will believe it, and it's actually not Proximus. It's you, it's the attacker. And this is used by police forces. These are called the Stingray devices to intercept communication. So there is actually, the network authenticates you, but you don't authenticate the network. Are you sure the freshness of the key? So are you sure this key is really fresh? Okay. And is Alice sure? Is Bob sure? And this depends in part also on key control. So key control is who influences the value of the session key. Why do I put this in yellow? Because, so as you will see at the exam, there is always a question about protocols, and I always ask key control, and then some people don't know what key control is. But it's in the slides, and you can bring the slides. And it's in the handbook about cryptography, which you can also bring. But even then, people don't seem to know what it is. So I put it here with a bomb and in yellow. So make sure you know what key control is. And of course, if you have key control, if Alice has key control, it means she can choose part of the randomness to the key. Then she can make sure the key is fresh by choosing new randomness. Okay? You can say, what if Alice chooses the same randomness as before? Yeah, well, then we can't help Alice. Because if Alice publishes all her keys, then she also has no security left. Right? So at some moment, you have to assume that parties protect their own interests. And so if you have key control, you can also have guarantee on key freshness, in principle. So very important is efficiency. We discussed this already. So how many bytes or how many round trips? How many calculations do you have to do? So this is very important. And so sometimes people give up on some properties to improve on performance. Is there a third party? You have certificates. And then also a very interesting question is, we discuss this with zero knowledge, do you afterwards want a proof of the interaction or not? And if you work for a bank, your boss will say, of course. because the European Central Bank imposes rules on the banks, and one thing is that you have to have evidence of everything that has been done. Now, if you talk to a human rights activist or an NGO active in a random country where human rights are not so respected, they want to have secure communications. Do they want the proof to remain afterwards? No. What they want is the property that Signal created, the first implemented, is off-the-record communication. And also WhatsApp copied this later. Off-the-record means that even if somebody intercepts the communication, you can always deny afterwards that you were involved in this. So there is nothing in the protocol that shows you were there. Okay? And by the way, the European Commission uses Signal as well. In spite of the fact that they keep going after encryption, they themselves use Signal. In fact, the designers of Signal are very unhappy about this because they believe that public servants should not have off-the-record communication using they should actually, what they should do is transparent and on the record. Of course, then the Commission officials, they claim that they also need off-the-record communication to strike deals. So but it just shows you that some settings you will want to have proof and some you want to have deniability. And it depends. And so again, you have protocols that provide one or the other. Now, the most difficult part is understanding the opponent. So the opponent in protocols, if you study protocols, is not breaking cryptography. So you assume somehow that the key is long enough, the key is well protected, the encryption is unbreakable, authenticated encryption is perfect, you don't see anything, you don't learn anything from the ciphertext, you can't modify any part of the plaintext, or the signatures cannot be forged, and so on. So you assume that the crypto is ideal, but in fact, you talk to the adversary. The network is managed by the adversary. And this sounded like a very extreme model, but after the Snowden documents, we know that in fact, the network is managed by the adversary, by the NSA. So it didn't get too much attention because it's pretty technical, and also the name was, I think, deliberately misleading. So it's something called quantum insertion. Have you heard of this? So it has nothing to do with quantum. It's just a cool name. They thought quantum was something cool. So it's an attack by the NSA. And what happens is you open your browser and you go to google.com. So you enter google.com. Okay. And of course, a protocol is being run. Normally, you run a protocol with Google to establish a key. But what happens if the NSA answers first? And that's what they do. They're just faster than Google. And then they set up a secure protocol. They spoof Google's keys, if you would really check. But so, in fact, you're now talking to the NSA, you have a secure channel to the NSA, and then they use this channel to inject malware on your device and take it over completely. Yes?
Then do we have the NSA's certificate? Is it in the list of the authorities?
They typically, I discussed this last week in the IDOS thing, so they have bribed somebody to produce a fake certificate for Google. So, and if you would check, you may detect it, that this is not a normal Google certificate. And maybe they will also not go after Google because it's so high profile, but they will go after something else that's less visible. And who checks this anyway? And so the interesting thing is that actually at the level of the ISP, it can be detected because you know what happens afterwards. After a bit of time, the answer of Google comes. And so in fact, the ISP sees this and could report this to you, that, hey, there seem to be some strange things happening to your device, but of course they don't do this. And I talked to some ISPs to convince them to work on this, but they're not interested. I guess they get a phone call to not be worried about this problem. But just to show you that, in fact, if you work on the network or the internet, you believe you're talking to other parties, you're talking to the NSA. That's really what happens. They intercept everything, so they have these ground stations everywhere. Optical cables, C cables come and land. There is interception. They detect videos of the cats. They filter those out because that's 90% of internet traffic. And then all the rest they keep. They check whether they analyze it. If it's encrypted, they store it in Utah. Right? That's what they do. They have a huge center in Utah that consumes. They need its own power plant. It's as big as the KU Leuven campus here outside, and it's just full of data storage. Everything you ever sent was encrypted, is stored there, just in case they can decrypt it in the future. So they can also, they listen to everything, but they can also intervene and modify. So more or less, if you talk to somebody on the internet, in fact, you're talking to the NSA, and the NSA decides what happens. And they can inject something else, they can modify your message, they can delay it, or they can just make you talk to a fake server. Okay, that's more or less the model, it seems like a very extreme model, but from Snowden documents, we know this is actually how it works in real life. And so what is the goal of the bad guys is to, of course, sometimes get your key, to be able to listen to your communication, or impersonate, so make you believe you're talking to Google when in fact you're talking to them, and then they serve malware on your device from their server. Or as we will see, there is also an example where they just create chaos. So you believe you talk to some party, but in fact the beliefs of the parties don't match. And then it can also be that the attacker is an insider. So it can be that it's somebody part of the system tries to create chaos, can also be an outsider. So, but in general, adversary is extremely powerful. And so we will show you pictures of messages from Alice to Bob. In fact, every message goes to the adversary and from the adversary to Bob. And the return as well. And the adversary looks at it and decides what to do with it. Delete it, delay it, change it, take some message from another protocol and inject it. That's more or less the game. So Roger Needham, one of the pioneers in cryptographic protocols, he called making cryptographic protocols is like programming Satan's computer. Right? It's very, very hard to do. It's very tricky, as we will see. Protocols of 3 or 4 lines can have serious security flaws, and sometimes it takes 15 years to find them, because it's really tricky to do. We're not done yet. We have still more definitions, and then we finally move to concrete examples to make it easier to understand. So you have to assume that at some moment you will be hacked. If you believe you're in charge of a system and you'll never be hacked, then I think this is just a stupid assumption. You will be hacked at some stage. And if you're hacked, it means your long-term keys are stolen. It means your future is bad. Because the person with your key, they're you. And as soon as you detect it, then you can try to recover, get new keys. And protocols like Signal and WhatsApp, they have very clever features in which they try to recover faster. But in general, you first have to detect there is a problem and then you have to recover. But until you're recovered, you're in really bad shape, because if somebody has your keys, they're you. What we know from the Snowden documents, for example, is that the NSA went to Microsoft and Google and so on, and they say, give us your keys. So they didn't even hack them, they just asked for them. How did they ask? A concept is called security letter. It's a letter from the US government to a company. If you speak about the letter, then the CEO goes to jail. And if you don't do what the letter says, the CEO goes to jail. Now, CEOs don't want to go to jail. They want to go to the yacht in the weekend. So they actually comply with those letters. There is examples like the email provider of Snowden himself. He got such a letter and he decided to shut down the company and not give the keys. That's what you can do as well. You can just shut down the company and say, oh, I lost everything, sorry. But then your company is shut down. I don't think Google wants to shut down because of such a letter, because too many people would be unhappy. But now the big question is, what happens to the past? Okay. And so what people discovered in the early 90s, if you have a clever design, if your long-term keys are compromised, your past communication remains secure. So the NSA will actually take these keys they got from you. They will go with this to Utah and see what they can decrypt. Now, if you have a good protocol, they will not be able to decrypt anything in Utah. Even if they have all your communication from the last 10 years, these keys they have now will not help them to compromise your past. If you have a bad protocol, NSA can actually take those keys and decrypt everything. This is why Google and Microsoft changed protocols in 2013. There is no 6 months after the Snowden documents, they changed their protocol to get this property, because it was obvious to the whole world that their keys were in the hands of somebody else, and that the NSA used this to read all past communications as well. So this has been solved for some protocols. It's called forward secrecy. It's not a good name, because some people call it historical secrecy or backward break protection. And also, the first authors called it perfect forward secrecy, which is really a terrible term, because perfect secrecy is like unconditional if the opponent has unlimited power, and that's not the case. So you don't have protection against opponents with unlimited power. So this is kind of easy to understand, but then it gets confusing because there is another problem, which is your session key may leak. It can also happen. That's not so bad, because if your session key leaks, then all your past communications are always secure, because a session key is a new key. And if you generate every time a new fresh session key, if one today leaks, there should have no implication on what happened yesterday. Even if NSA goes to Utah, the session key of today should be independent of the one of yesterday. So your session key will never impact on the past. But if you have a bad protocol, if you leak a session key today, it can be used to keep doing bad things in the future. And then we speak of a known key attack. So you once obtain a session key, which should not be so bad, but then it turns out that because of a flaw in the protocol, you can keep using this problem later on as well. And it's called a known key attack, or you can be secure against a known key attack. Now, I agree these are bad terms, because of course also here a key is known, namely a long-term key, and here it's a short-term key that is known. So the terms are a bit confusing. And probably if we could start over, we would give different names, but it's too late. Okay, so deal with it. But you have the slide on the exam, and if you're confused, I will always ask, is this protocol vulnerable against known key attack or against forward? Does this protocol offer forward secrecy? You can, if you forgot what it is, there is a slide where you can look up what it is. Okay, so let's just do one protocol before the break, so at least you have an idea. We look at a very simple protocol, symmetric key, so we use encryption or pseudo-random functions. So this is like a random function, more or less in practice. Think of a MAC, CBC MAC or HMAC or something like this. We only look at point-to-point. And as we will see, getting forward secrecy is hard here. But I'll show you a solution. Let's do the protocol. So the protocol is you have two players, Alice and Bob, and they share a long-term secret key. So you can think of your mobile operator that has given you a SIM card. In this case, the user is Bob, has a SIM card with a key, and the operator has a database with all the secret keys. And the protocol is very simple. The mobile operator sends a random number to Bob. And then both parties compute a session key by applying a MAC algorithm, so to the random function. With this key, they share to the random number RA. Okay, that's it. That's the protocol. Now the question is, what kind of properties does this offer? Is there empty authentication? Does Alice know that Bob is active? That's an easy question. She doesn't hear from Bob, so of course she doesn't know whether he's active. I mean, the adversary can have taken this message and just deleted it. And Bob would not even know that Alice talked to him. Does Bob know that Alice is there and active? No, because she just sent a random number. Anybody can send a random number. It doesn't have your name or has nothing involved. So in fact, you have no idea. So this protocol provides no authentication. So if you would want authentication, for example, this is what happens in 2G, is that Bob would send a MAC on this value, a different MAC than this one, of course, not a PR, but a MAC on this value, and then Alice would know that Bob is active, because then you have a challenge response protocol. But this is not present in my simple example here. So now this protocol actually offers implicit key authentication. What does it mean? Alice knows that only Bob can find the key. Why is this? Because Alice knows that only Bob has the key necessary to compute the session key. And similarly, Bob knows that only Alice can find the key. Only Alice is the other party knowing the key K, so only Alice can find the session key by applying the PRF. So there is mutual implicit key authentication. Alice knows that only Bob can find the key. Bob knows that only Alice can find the key. Is there key confirmation? Does Alice know that Bob has the key? No, because the adversary could have deleted this random number and Alice wouldn't know. Does Bob know Alice has the key? Or somebody else? Not really, because of course Bob knows that somebody has RA, but he doesn't know that this party also has the key. So it could come from somebody else who doesn't know the key, and then this party would not be able to find the key. And anyway, there is no evidence that this computation has taken place. So there is no key confirmation. Key control. Who controls the value of the key? That's easy. That's Alice, because Alice chooses RA. So Alice has key control. Bob has no key control, because the random number is chosen by Alice. And also Alice knows the key is fresh, but Bob doesn't know. So in fact, this is a protocol used by 2G, 3G, 4G, 5, well, from 3G on there is extra protection. And even in 2G, as I said, Bob answers with the MAC. But so more or less, So of course the operator knows that we'll always choose a different array, but what happens is if you travel to, say, Italy, your operator is not going to give your key to the Italians. What they will send to the Italians, they will send the random number and the corresponding session key. In fact, they will not send 1, they will send 5. So if you switch on your phone in Italy, then the operator in Italy says, oh, this is user here. He goes back to Proximus. Proximus sends them 5 random numbers and keys. And the Italian operator can send you a random number and get the key. And they can do this 5 times. And what they do the 6th time, the protocol says you have to go back to Belgium and ask for 5 more. What do they do in practice? Very often they just reuse these things because that's easier, right? So the problem is that Bob doesn't know this because Bob doesn't know whether RA is fresh or not. And then you can say, oh, Bob can keep all the random numbers he ever got. No, you don't do that. If you start storing all the random numbers you get in protocols, it just doesn't work. Random numbers, you assume they're fresh and you can't keep track of them. So Bob has no idea of key freshness, so it's very easy to send the same RA to Bob and make Bob reuse an old session key. But Alice knows there is freshness because she knows whether she chose a fresh RA or not, or whether she reused an RA. Because if she wants to reuse an RA, she has to do it deliberately. And then is there a known key attack? So assume that as an attacker you found somehow the session key. So what is the problem here? If you found the session key and you record the same RA, you can actually a year later send RA again and the session key will be the same. So in fact, this protocol is vulnerable against a known key attack. Once you have the key, you can make this party use the key forever. And so, in fact, compromise of a session key, it never influences past session keys, but you can mess up all the future session keys. And then finally, is there forward secrecy? So then you have to think what happens. So the long-term keys leak. Reliable long-term keys, well, this is the capital K. So assume that the NSA goes to the operator and asks for the key. By the way, this is how it happened in real life. So at the smart cards producing the SIMs, every Friday, knock on the door, French government, give us all the keys so you produce this week. Okay? And so this is how the French state had all the keys. And by the way, what's in the Snowden documents, I told this to somebody with access to the Snowden documents, and they looked for it. It turns out that the British intercepted this interface, because after a while they made it automated, because they stopped coming physically to the building. They just asked for an interface where they could download the keys, and then the British hacked this interface, so they also got all the keys. And that's in the Snowden documents. But anyway, so once you have a key, so even if you get the key not at the beginning, but you get this key only after 2 years, if you stored all the RA numbers, you can now find all the session keys and decrypt all the sessions. So there is no forward secrecy here. Once you have the key, you can go back to your UTE database with all the encryptions. You can find all the random numbers, compute all the session keys, and decrypt everything. So there is no forward secrecy. How could you achieve forward secrecy? There is a simple trick, which is used by Singwell and then copied by WhatsApp, is that after a while you hash this key. You keep hashing your key all the time. And then if you find to compromise the key at one time, you can't go back. That sounds like an easy thing to do, and it's okay for messaging. But of course, for email, it's very tricky. Because you have your key, and every day you hash your key, and then suddenly an email comes from the previous day that was delayed somewhere. And then, oops, I hashed my key, I can't go back. So for email, it doesn't work very well, because in email, there is no bound on the time that an email takes to deliver. But for messaging, messaging is more or less interactive, and the server knows when it's delivered to you. So there you can do this kind of stuff. But in general, in the old protocols, it was not done because communications were so unreliable. It was kind of risky to hash your key and then risk that you actually lost your communication. Okay, so I already gave away the problem. So this is actually a terrible protocol. It doesn't achieve much, but still it's the most widely used protocol, because it's in something like 6.5 billion mobile phones. And again, I cheated because, so in fact, Bob sends a MAC on RA, so in fact, it does identify Bob, but that doesn't stop any of the other problems. And that's the 2G protocol. From 3G on, Alice also sends a MAC on a serial number. And that's the only thing you do. And that authenticates Alice. And Bob keeps track of the serial numbers he has received in the last few days, so he knows whether it was fresh or not. So, but at least you have now an illustration that all these properties are necessary, and so this protocol achieves implicit key authentication, but not explicit, and it doesn't achieve anti-authentication. And why is this kept so simple, and why are we still using this protocol with a small twist? Because it's mobile devices. Again, you should think of 1988, the power of computers at that time. So at that time, a PC had a clock speed of 16 megahertz, and a smart card could not do RSA operations in 1988, for sure not. So doing a cryptographic operation on a smart card was already quite a challenge to do it in a certain number of milliseconds. So this is a system that was conceived in 1987, 88, and so it's now still being used by billions of people. So that's another lesson, is that if you go somewhere and make a protocol, it will probably live for 30 years. So think carefully before you do something, because changing something afterwards is very hard. But so the people who designed this knew, of course, of the problems, but they just didn't think that anybody would have put up false base stations. That was not something that people could conceive, because base stations were so complex and so expensive that nobody thought that the police would be able to buy them, or you could buy them on eBay for a few thousand euros, right? And that, of course, happened 10 years later. Good, so after the break, we'll look at the variant of the protocol. So what happens if Bob can also send RB? And then you compute the key as PRF on the concatenation of RA and RB. That gives you slight improvements. But that we'll discuss after the break. You can think about it during the break if you want to.